process that might have been set up, but still, if the rules and policies can be changed at any time, how can we establish sensors and feedback loops to then steer? And yeah, so we discovered a lot of challenges, I guess, and maybe you can help us to answer some of our questions. Yeah, Michael, thanks for being here. Thanks for taking the time. Excited for your talk.
Unfortunately, I don't know that I'll give you answers so much as I hope to give you tools to help find answers. So we're going to talk about algorithms as policy, and it's going to build up through measurement, reputation, and rewards. And the reason I want to talk about algorithms as policy kind of builds on what Angela just said about the difference between being able to change the rules and being able to act within them. And that includes your, reward systems or measurement systems and the reward systems they affect. So my talk sort of starts off with this discussion of a platform. And in this context, we could think of this as anything from a, piece of software that facilitates other activities to a community to, even literally your municipality, some of the governance infrastructure in sort of the meat space world. It kind of has this characteristic that there's going to be some abstraction between the interactions that occur within the scope of the rules, the work that's done to provide that platform, and the work that's actually done to sort of make the rules within that platform. And so we can think of it for ease in terms of platform economies, things like Airbnb and Uber, or you can think of it in sort of a Web3 context where you have a protocol and a piece of software that is enabling some sort of interaction between what I'm calling the supplier and the consumer. And in our case, we're assuming that something being built is meant to enable something else. So the enabled peer-to-peer interaction is part of the purpose of the thing. And what that interaction is meant to be might vary widely, but ultimately, if we're building and measuring, then we're probably in this lower right-hand bucket, the algorithmic policymaker. And so I'm going to take a moment to explore that as it pertains to the sort of system as a whole in this sort of abstract platform thing. So I'm calling it the platform abstraction. So in the platform abstraction, if we're looking at the world from the perspective of the supplier and the consumer, or more generally the users in the peer-to-peer interaction, then they may have to pay for service, maybe not. They're probably reading, writing, and executing in the platform software, or if it's not software at all, you can think about this as their interactions with the enabling substrate. But what matters really is that there's a extent to which the people providing the platform could be thought of as sort of a labor source for maintenance that is within the set of rules. And that's where I put service level agreements here, and I'm buckling out the sort of service providers a level below. If we're talking about a Web3 platform, this could be something like miners or generalized miners, or someone doing mostly automated labor, but ultimately maintaining the thing that provides the service first order, acting within the rules and having their labor valued by likely algorithms. Like, hey, did you follow the rules? Did you meet the SLAs? What was your downtime? What was your participation rates, et cetera? And so if you're in the sort of service provider category here, then your efforts affect the experience of the enabled activity, but you're not necessarily defined as the enabled activity. And on the other hand, you have, again, some rulemaking, which might pertain to how much reward someone gets, but they may also pertain to what's considered activity that what is considered appropriate activity, like excluding or including certain things. In the Gitcoin DAO, for example, there are work streams just to figure out what kinds of activities count, much less the specific rewards assigned to them. And this is a necessity in the presence of things like terms of service, because in order to provide good service to the people who act within the terms of service, you also have to be able to define what those terms are and exclude things that don't satisfy them. So that's sort of a maybe it's a harkening back to sort of Ostrom's discussion of boundaries. You actually need to define the boundaries, and then you do need to sort of measure and act on them. And so it's a variety of things that are in the rulemaking that affect the end users, but maybe they're abstracted away. They don't really care necessarily, except when it affects them directly, and then they have strong opinions. So if you're the service provider here, then you want to make sure that there's enough demand on the platform to generate the value, to generate the potential for revenue in order to offset your costs. And again, you're largely beholden to the rules, again, measurement, reputation, and rewards that are determined by the algorithmic policymaking bucket. So this kind of jumps ahead to where I think most of our discussion lies, and that is, how does the software development or mechanism design work, or even the ongoing governance of that software, those mechanisms actually take place within one of these systems. And in practice, if we have a decentralized system, we probably don't even have like an individual team doing tasking around defining, analyzing, and changing policy, though in many cases we do. In fact, one of the major points of re-centralization in a decentralized community is when a relatively small group of people has all of this authority due to, maybe history as the original algorithm designers, or maybe for a variety of reasons, the proposals that go through the DAO are only coming from a small group, or the token holders or voting powers are limited to a small group of people. Then, you might find that this capability is the thing that's really bottlenecked on those people, because it requires a lot of work and expertise and knowledge about the particular system. In addition to, as we will discuss, data. So the platform abstraction here assumes some software or at least some capacity for getting data and putting it into software that allows us to measure things. And so those measurements that we define will ultimately determine what we do, because we generally measure things that we want to make go up or down, we optimize. And although it may be a dynamic optimization with a lot of uncertainty, it's pretty common to see that as you lay out those KPIs and you collect data to see whether you're succeeding, your choices within this group, even if it is decentralized, are going to kind of have a shelling point around improving those KPIs. So even still, if we have a decentralized group fulfilling this algorithmic policymaking, if we have set the KPIs, then we have actually sort of established, the basis of our choices. So we'll have debates and discussions about how to make those KPIs go up. And there's this remaining risk around whether the KPIs are actually representative of the underlying phenomena desired. And that's where we bring things like user feedback in this drawing in, and where introducing like ethnographic methods, going out and interviewing people and engaging with the end users, or in this case also the service providers, the operators, to understand what their needs are and how they're experiencing things. In a traditional engineering discipline like civil engineering, this is public engagement. You literally go out and talk to people who are being affected by the things being built and changed, because there's an extent to which you can never perfectly represent the full breadth of real life with data. So I'm going to kind of jump down. This is a slide from a paper that Sherman and I wrote on the foundations of crypto economics, sort of teasing in the direction of governance as being the sort of byproduct of crypto systems. And in particular, that's because even when it's an economic system, you're largely using goal making and sort of measurements and goals and driving systems towards a particular, say, KPI, or fulfilling some sort of purpose that is intended by those goals. But we still have this feedback loop where the policy making is affected by the goals that were set, which are measured by some sort of data, which is implementing some rewards, and those rewards drive user behavior, which results in emergent properties, and those emergent system level behaviors or properties are the things really that we're measuring and then steering against. So this kind of feedback loop is exactly what we're hoping to accomplish in these token engineered systems, but with the understanding that the sort of measurement is actually imperfect. Like, it is necessarily imperfect because these are socio-technical systems and you can't measure everything. All of your measures are effectively proxies for something else. And so what we find ourselves doing is looking at the spectrum of the kinds of decisions that get made in these organizations. And I tend to break them down in frequency domain. So like on one side, we have the lower decision frequency. These tend to be subjective and conservative. Conservative meaning we should make the decision slowly and not make changes and not make big changes unless we really need to. And this is where we say, change the rules or change the KPIs or change, I'll talk about it later, but like the weights of various KPIs. We're doing governance action when we are changing things to the far right, whereas the further we go to the left, the more we want things to be fast and low level and sort of hard coded. So when I say low level protocols, I mean like, the very nature of the communication pattern, whereas the algorithmic policies are more like, things you might change, like an inflation rate or a, some parameters or rules in the code that are still factored out so that they're changeable. We might need to make a decision to change them, whereas the lowest level stuff is really, I like to think of it as hard coded, and it's often ontological, meaning it defines the very structure of the system that you're controlling or steering. As we move from left to right, though, we get from these really low level hard coded things that act fast and like effectively never change, they're a given, to things that are acting fast, but not quite so fast, meaning that they might be over a batch or an epoch or a period, but the algorithms execute them. So we trust them because their policy making was defined at the level of, hey, we made this rule and the code executes and we all see the results. And if we need to change them, we might change those rules through governance. Discretionary policies tend to be used around operational roles. They're empowering humans to do stuff that are bounded by often algorithms, like that you might use algorithms to define the scope, of the discretion of the individuals. But if you want to avoid having, governance processes for everything, it's often helpful to draw a line between, say, the activities that are care and maintenance work, things that go on and they still require decisions and actions by humans, but their work isn't to change the direction of things, it's actually to maintain things. And so I tend to bucket discretionary policies there specifically for activities that are not meant to cause a change in the behavior of the system, but rather upkeep or maintenance of the behavior of the system, but require human inputs. And then governance is going to relate to human inputs that are actually changing or steering or adjusting things. And thus, this distinction I like to make is, if you are making human decisions to take property A and keep property A, then it's probably discretionary policy territory. If you are making human decisions and your goal is to change from property A to property A prime, then you probably need to go through a governance process. And that separation helps avoid bogging everything down into governance. But we're here to talk more on the side of, I think, algorithmic policies. I think reward systems tend to fall in that category, and that we generally would see changes to the reward systems within the governance process scope on this diagram. Keep in mind that here low-level protocols might include things like, if the rewards being issued are a token, then the fact that it's an ERC20, which means that you can transfer it, it has these other implications, maybe that would be in low-level protocols, meaning it's so hard-coded that it doesn't really make sense to think about changing it, but it also still provides properties that we rely on, and it's algorithmic, it's automated, and it enables decentralization because that sort of communication protocol is established and and understood by all parties interacting within the system. So if we're using algorithms to automate the execution of rules, then it's great that the consequences of actions are transparent, but ultimately it relies on observable data. And this makes it susceptible to Goodhart's law, which basically means anything that you're measuring, once you start using it as a KPI, it gets worse as a metric, because what ends up happening is that the letter of the rule starts to supersede the spirit of the rule. Like, you designed the measurement to capture a phenomena, and it was good at that until you started using it that way, which actually created extra incentives around it and sort of blurs or weakens its power as a measurement, which means two things. One, as I said, it's a representation or a proxy whenever you create a measurement. So they're enshrining the subjectivities of the designer, of the algorithms, of the metrics. So we have to be aware of that. On the other hand, we have to be aware of this degradation. So there is some degree of maintenance work to just continuing to monitor whether the metric being used or the collection of metrics being used is actually continuing to fulfill its function within that system. And if it's not, there may need to be either some degree of discretionary policies around maintaining or tuning to keep the behavior the same, or some larger governance processes in order to change the metrics completely. And if we sort of jump into measurement, I want to kind of go back to, this is one of my slides from a talk I gave some years ago in The Hague, where I broke down sort of the layers of these systems and looked at them as social, economic, technological, and physical, and kind of went all the way from the really low level stuff up to the sort of high level system goals, and realized that in the process of this, you get up to goals at the top, but actually what you can measure is at the bottom. And this hopefully helps to underscore the fact that, you know, your measurements are effectively proxies, because although you care about sort of goals in the phenomenon space, like I want to accomplish some outcome in the world, you almost always are dealing with data, which is captured from the interactions of the agents driving those goals, which just means that there's a sort of distance between even the best, most granular representations that you can come up with and the real state of the world. And we'll talk about that a little bit more as we move down, but it continues to highlight this fact that the objective measures, the KPI choices, are subjective choices. Another way to think about this is, if you have really granular data, then you also have to do a aggregation of some kind in order to bring it up to a system level KPI. And so one of my favorite examples here is that, you know, you could make a social utility function by summing over all of the individual utility functions, but you can also make a social utility function by taking the minimum of all of the utility functions of all of the players. And if you maximize the sum of the utilities, you'll get a very different outcome than if you maximize the minimum of all of the utilities. In fact, in optimization theory, these two constructs can give almost opposite optimals, in the sense that sum of utilities in some settings is going to lead to one actor who can generate lots and lots of utility and negative externalities on everyone else, but having the highest sum of utilities, which will be a terrible score in the minimum one, where you're maximizing the minimum, because it means that the minimum is quite low, because you've exposed externalities on people. And on the other hand, if you use the max of min, then it's unlikely that you'll get any sort of long tail sort of positive outcomes, which could be also problematic depending on what you're doing. If you're trying to do innovation, then you might really want to pour fuel on the fire of the successful thing and make the top number go up. But if you're doing sort of care and maintenance, it's quite the opposite. You want to bring the bottom up. And so you, again, can't predetermine which kind of sort of social utility aggregation you want, because it matters what your system is trying to accomplish, and even some of the values of that system become part of what you're encoding when you choose your measurements. So I'm going to jump into some source cred based examples. You don't necessarily need to think of this as unique to source cred. You can think of it as contribution graphs. Anytime there's a rich number of ways you could contribute to something, and those contributions are interlinked, you get these sort of contribution graph-like things, which basically represent, people and the activities they undertake and the dependencies upon those things. As long as you have a contribution graph, now you have a nice rich model of the world over which to attribute value. And so a graph-based approach to interpreting the value of activities would basically say, here's G, it's a space of all of the graphs of contributions, basically people and the activities that interweb them with the thing you're doing together. You use some heuristics or some algorithmic policies to turn that into a weighted graph. So basically you end up with a digraph, a directed graph with weights, a weighted digraph. And that itself is still not really a metric in the sense that it provides a score to the individuals. It just puts numbers on this topological object, the graph. Once you have that, you can use a different kind of graph metric to turn it into, a vector over the actors. And, source cred is an example where PageRank is that algorithm. It's an approach to taking a weighted graph and turning it into a measure over the nodes. And in particular, the measure over the nodes representing contributors is cred. So if we understand, though, that this is a general construct, we can go from a graph, which is, say, a contribution graph, or a object representing people, their activities, and how those activities are intertwined. Well, for starters, indexing, that's hard. You're always going to have activities that get missed. So we actually have a subgraph of the contribution graph, which is the things actually observed by the community and indexed. Then you can build a graph, and then you can take that graph and you can turn it into numbers. And in the case of source cred, that looks something like this. This is the top few contributors from source cred today. I haven't been particularly active for some years, but I've continued to follow along and have been sort of blessed to have the source cred community participating in some ethnographic trials using Discord bots with MetaGov. Huge fan of this community and how they govern themselves even. And they have this tool that they use to sort of try to keep track. And, the scores are really not the most important thing in my mind. I think it's a lot of the norms around the behavioral, like what's appropriate behavior that sort of complements the way the rules work that really makes it function. But one of the reasons why I use this example still is because PageRank, which is pretty commonly known as an effective measurement tool, has these properties that when you play with the weights, you can actually kind of change the results. So I wrote a short article called Subjectivity and Algorithms, Exploring Subjectivity and Algorithms a few years ago, where I basically used the PageRank constructs in source cred to show that we could flip around the scores by just tuning the weights. And this is a little silly. It might seem arbitrary, but the point is actually that, they're both right. That if the community were to have a certain set of interpretations of what value is, they might change the weights in their in the way they index activities, and then the scores would actually change dramatically, so much so that the order of the actors in the examples actually flip. And I would recommend people go check that article out if they're interested in this kind of thing, because it's very demonstrative. I use some Python code and some clearly sort of very clear line graphs and circle graphs and ones that make it really obvious what you would expect to happen, and then show that depending on how you tune the algorithm, you get different results. And so that brings us into reputation, because, at least source cred is one of its descriptions is as a reputation, but I want to talk about how reputation actually affects communities as well. So ultimately, the agents or actors within these communities are people, and the reputations are sort of measurements. But reputations are a little different from absolute KPIs in the sense that they probably should be interpreted as peer-to-peer, meaning you have a reputation with me, you have a reputation with so-and-so, those can be different. So if we think of that as another kind of weighted graph, contextualized weighted graph in a social system, again, it might emerge from something like a contribution graph. And this is another view on a contribution graph. It's a description largely using, a Git-like syntax where we sort of imagine, people are posting things and or committing things and reviewing them and merging them, etc. But the idea is actually to show that people have different interactions with each other. So like my reputation for someone who I've interacted with, maybe I reviewed their work. They made a post, I peer reviewed it, I approved it, the community pushed it out. I might have a much stronger sense of their contributions than someone who's working in a whole different circle or a whole different working group within my community. And so it's actually not just that the reputations are local, they also have they have local in two ways, right? They're local in the sense of a neighborhood within the graph where I can actually observe the activities of a subset of other people who are, attention space similar to me. We're paying attention and working on the same stuff. So that's local. And then it's local in the sense that I have a reputation for someone and someone else might have a different reputation for that same person. So this actually comes back to the graph construct because it means I have a neighborhood. My neighborhood is the people who I have direct edges to, for which I individually might hold reputation scores. But those are things that are, local. They're mine. I might have very different weightings or reasons for why I think the person is high reputation for different people, depending on which contexts we share. And one of the reasons I like the source cred reference case is that at least early in source cred, you could also pull you could actually go to a part of the web page where you could retune the algorithm and see what people's scores were. So in a sense, I could even have a local metric, not just a sort of local abstract reputation, because if I really wanted to say, hey, these are the things I care about, I could get a view on the cred scores, which wasn't the one driving the rewards, but it was still something that I could choose to create in the moment with a UI to see how people would score given my choice of preferences over the various metrics or the various types of contributions and weights over those types. But in a broad sense, we're coming back to something that I call an attribution network, which is, if we're talking about these kinds of contribution graphs, then they're directed acyclic graphs. We could think of them as being just if you think of them in immutable or content addressed sense, you would just have a record, a document, a post, a Git hash, whatever. And over time, this thing just keeps growing because it's append only with lots of dependencies. But in a lot of graphs that we might construct, we would actually compress this back into a cyclic graph because as a document goes through its life cycle, it a piece of code, a blog, whatever, it's going to keep being mutated. And so in the DAG sense, it's a new one with the old one as a dependency. In the sort of cyclic graph sense, it's the same one, but what you've actually done is collapsed those nodes into one node, which is making what the directed acyclic graph into a cyclic graph due to the codependencies between things. It's a neat trick. I'm going to keep moving past that. It's not that I'm suggesting everything needs to be done that way from a computational standpoint. It's a really good mental model because it's old. If you think about authorship of books, for example, you can already start to make one of these DAGs. And if you think about bibliometrics and sort of the history of the sort of science of the contribution graphs vis-a-vis co-authorship and the production of research or such things, you actually get exactly these kinds of graphs. And so it makes sense to reason about co-production in this way, in part because it's sort of persisted through different technologies. It's persisted in the way we behave. And it still boils down to a kind of a contribution graph with a subset of contexts being indexed. So this kind of brings me back to avoiding God's eye measurement systems, which is to say that if we have a rich computational environment with lots of data, then instead of building a God's eye measurement where we say, this is the score, we should be providing tools for people to sort of express preferences over how important particular attributes are and aren't. In some client projects, for example, we've advocated for, collections of KPIs, especially over service providers or operators. Suppose we're talking about something like the Filecoin network and you have storage providers, you might say, make sure that although there's lots of data about the performance of those service providers, you don't release just one metric that says this is the good one, because that will sort of really skew the supply and demand and pricing. Because in reality, there's going to be a variety of attributes. Maybe some service providers have lower quality but lower prices because they just don't spend as much resources. And so there's a different, equilibrium there for a market demand for lower SLAs and lower prices versus higher SLAs and higher prices, or any number of other complex attributes that relate to this much higher dimensional space of effectively a labor economy or a computational labor economy. So moving away from this idea that there's one KPI, at least for an individual service provider or operator, to a family of KPIs where the importance of those various KPIs might vary by context. So I might care a lot more about KPI 1, 2, and 3 and really not give a damn about 4, 5, and 6, but you might be just the opposite. And in fact, if we want price to emerge in a system like that, then you really do need to respect those attributes. And I'll drop a link afterwards. I have another paper on semi-fungibility that relates to this point, but it's a little bit far afield for the talking about sort of reputation and reward systems today. But broadly speaking, it falls in the same family that we might have context dependent value, but we need to capture data about the attributes that confer that value. So finally, we'll get into the last section on rewards. And so I'm going to talk about this as issuing tokenized rewards, but I don't necessarily mean on-chain tokenized. I just mean that like rewards are tokens, like stickers for your, kindergartners are tokens. So in this sense, we're pointing out that it matters not just that you're getting rewards, but it matters how those rewards are distributed. If you give stickers to everyone, or if you give 20 stickers to one person and 1 to everyone else, that's going to affect how people perceive those rewards. It's not just, hey, I got some. It matters the individual allocation or distribution as well as the collective quantity. And so if we have a measurement apparatus, we have at least 2 different kinds of policies that are happening concurrently and in an interrelated way. One is how the measurement at the individual level, or measurements at the individual level, are determining what share of the rewards being issued someone's getting. And another question, which is how many rewards are being given. And so what's tricky about this is that it's effectively an expression of a collective action problem where it's unlikely that everyone will ever totally agree. And part of the reason you use a measurement apparatus is to make it more legitimate and feel more fair because everyone agreed to those rules in advance. The tricky part, though, is that it doesn't necessarily guarantee the desired outcomes. It's a sort of pretty canonical policymaking problem where you set up the rules thinking that you're going to get a particular outcome, and then something else happens. And normally that means revisit the rules you made and ask whether you need to adjust them to drive the desired outcome. But Angela's point at the beginning, you also can't do that too much. So you have to find the right cadence and the right approach to those adjustments. But for starters, we can try to make this feel a little bit fair even when we adjust by introducing a richer measurement apparatus. So if we think of our various data collection mechanisms as sensors, as these KPIs as ways of measuring what's going on, you could say, well, let's start by saying, there's a bunch of different things that we could measure and do measure, and we don't know in advance how important they are going to be. So we could take weights on them, or we could aggregate them using the min or the max, or we could aggregate them by sum, or we can combine some sort of weighted aggregation mechanism with a plurality of metrics. And now a big part of the governance is actually tuning the weights, not necessarily adding and removing new measurements. Or it could be adding and removing new measurements, but otherwise keeping many of them present intact. So, maybe there are 6 measurements and you add a 7th, or maybe there are 6 measurements and you feel like one of them is just not helping and you remove it. These are governance actions over your measurement apparatus, which can be thought of as policymaking. And so at the end of the day, we want to separate out the rules for, how much do we mint conditioned on aggregate measurement? What's the distribution conditioned on individual measurement? Okay, what are the sensors that actually capture individual contributions in the collective? Like, do we have a contribution graph? What are we indexing? How are we weighting the things that we're indexing? We start to actually be able to construct a representation which at least feels genuine to the thing being measured, and then basically break it down into machinery that solves those 2 main questions. How many new tokens or how many new rewards to mint, and how should they be distributed? With a reminder that this is going to be an ongoing game, right? This isn't a one-shot. So if it doesn't feel fair, part of the game is changing the game. If the purpose of the group is not being met, then this is the apparatus to go to and adjust to try to steer. And so you need to have enough flexibility that people can go back and adapt it, but enough rigidity that people trust it. And that was the gist of this drawing, actually, in one of the short source code articles I wrote on network formation games. It basically talks about the decisions of the individual contributors as strategic actions and the decisions of the maintainers, where at that time, we were discussing the maintainers as being sort of responsible for selecting the various weights, some of these algorithmic policy-making activities. Now, I think in practice, we've moved and continue to move in a direction which is more like this governance as multi-scale adaptation. This is actually from the original social sensor fusion short paper / proposal that gave rise to conviction voting. And I don't know if people know this, but conviction voting was originally intended for continuous parametered variables, and that we shifted in a direction of focusing on passing proposals using trigger functions, because that was particularly what was needed in the sort of common stack one hive research cases. But the function was to sense the misalignment or alignment between some parameters in a measurement system or some parameters in a decision-making system, and allow people to propose those changes and to adapt those values over time by basically merging preferences. And the key aspect to this drawing is actually in this lower loop. You see stuff happens in the world, people observe or experience outcomes, and they have their own perceptions of it. And if they don't feel as though it's representative, they can express a preference into a system that can actually mutate those rules. Now, I'm not necessarily saying you need to use conviction voting for this, but the idea is that this process should take place. There should be a means of looking at the measurement apparatus, the choice of KPIs, the weights of those KPIs, the aggregations, the way in which you index activities and attribute them to individuals versus attribute them to the group, all have to be part of this policy constellation that ultimately steers your organization. And so that difficulty is that that's hard even in a centralized setting, right? If I'm a executive and I have a team and I'm responsible for, say, looking at both the company's progress towards its stated goal and for assessing the untangling of the contributions of the individuals in order to reward and compensate them, I'm already solving what is effectively an untenable problem. There isn't an absolute objective answer. There is a lens through which I interpret the individual activities as some complex graph web thing, and that somehow that collection of activities that's interdependent gave rise to that, group level outcome. And so any attempt to decompose the collective outcome into individual contributions is going to be subjective, and therefore it is going to be an act of policy making. And the trick here is to just get over that and then work together to come up with something that works, including a process for adapting that thing, which brings me to my last slide, which is basically about, and again, actually, this is also from my paper with Sherman, about how we can emerge a sort of democratic process inside of a platform. So we have this technological infrastructure. It contains the data and the mechanisms, and then we do stuff and we use it. And if it works for us, we should probably keep it more or less the same. If it doesn't work for us, then we need some governance process through which we can change either the structures themselves, which data we're collecting, what affordances that technology offers, or more easily, more directly, edit the parts of the code that represent policy, the measurement apparatuses, the weights, the KPIs that we compute from that measurement apparatus. But it's important to understand there's a lot going on there. You have a ontological sort of representation, something like a contribution graph or a notion of what kinds of contribution exists at all, some machinery for measuring or collecting data about it, some other machinery for taking that and attributing it to specific KPIs at the system level, another machinery for attributing it to specific KPIs at the individual level, another machinery for taking those pieces of information and determining some aggregate total rewards to issue and some share that each individual is going to get on some period. Also, what period you do that on affects the outcome. So, there's this whole constellation of algorithmic policies that are baked into this idea of rewards. And so hopefully that doesn't scare anyone off, but the idea is that this is, not a objectively solvable problem. It's a policy design problem, but it's a really interesting and really important policy design problem, and one that's ultimately going to be achieved by, token engineering processes, just without forgetting that it happens within a scope of a social outcome, which means you care about the mission, vision, values of the community you're designing for. And so the right answer is going to be different depending on those things. So that is my talk. Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot. This was awesome. Actually, a lot of food for thoughts for our particular questions that I mentioned in the beginning. Now, everyone, I'm sure you have questions or comments. Let's check the chat. And feel free to switch on your mic and just ask away. So there's
just to note, this comment about metagame is true. So metagame actually pioneered one of the first non-source cred instances. So source cred uses source cred. Metagame had an implementation called the source that was sort of actively collaborating with source cred, did some of the early identity resolution stuff, helped enable some of the new plugins. Now they have their own instance called XP that they use. And so they do their token issuance of seeds via their XP instantiation of source cred. And I've also actually a big fan. I've been a metagame member from about the same time period. So I kind of got into them together because I was like learning and hacking and researching on this kind of graph-based interpretation of contributions in community projects.
Can you say something about their KPIs, or how they established any, or is this, or maybe also a process of measuring current state? Is there anything
So what's interesting about organizations that use source cred is that they have a good mechanism for measuring distribution, but I would argue that there's still a vacancy in measurement of like how much new rewards to create. So
Mhm.
source cred is fundamentally based on PageRank, and PageRank is based on like ultimately produces a stochastic vector. So a stochastic vector is a vector that sums to 1. And if you create a vector that sums to 1, what you're actually doing is creating a distribution rule, but it doesn't tell you how much to distribute. And so I would argue that the seed production in metagame, for example, is like somewhat ad hoc. Like I don't know what they're using currently to decide how many new seeds to distribute per period. I suspect it's a fixed amount, or maybe they have an internal meeting to decide how productive that they've been. There's like layers of player. So like I was at peak platinum level player. It's a game, right? It's got the sort of diamond, platinum, gold, silver, bronze tier players. And so when I was super active, I got as high as platinum before I think I've fallen to silver. But the point is, like, some processes within the community are used to decide, but I think that they have like algorithms for distribution, but then a much more, at least it seems, a much more subjective or heuristic approach to total distribute.
Okay, we have questions. Henrik.
Yeah, thanks. So this is fascinating. I was just wondering, if you're new as a DAO and you don't know actually really which direction to move because people are still coming in and it's all sort of evolving and mushrooming, how do you implement the attribution model? So okay, now we know we're going this, and we're covering 50% because we now have agreement, and then we have improvement protocols, voting stuff for the rest of it. Or how does it sort of mushroom?
Yeah. So the life cycle of DAOs is pretty interesting because in my experience, really early DAOs are often bootstrapped off of existing, think of it like the reputation graph thing, where people have observed as humans each other's work, and they have develop rapport and appreciation for each other's work. And so the reputation graph thing is present, but it's not indexed really at all, right? It's entirely people's impressions of each other. And so when you start trying to put infrastructure in place that turns some of this into code, the onus is to try to understand whether or not the particular patterns that you have as a small group are actually going to still work as the group gets big. And in fact, I would argue that the introduction of algorithmic policy is generally part of the scaling process. So as long as the group remains small and the activities are highly observable to each other, it makes sense to stick to relatively basic sort of, voting and approving it, just like without trying to algorithmatize. But then when you need to be able to support things like working groups that can't see each other all the time, you start to need more explicit mechanisms to make sure that things aren't missed. I tend to advocate for, sociocracy or sociocracy adjacent sort of circles, working groups, transversal circles, which represent, people from the various circles coming together to sort of scale the social aspects of the system. And only once the value production mechanisms are sort of starting to mature, do you really want to transition to enshrining them in code? Because when you enshrine them in code, they get two properties. One is that they are less transparent to at least some people. Like the consequences of them or the documentation might be transparent, but like you start to take the non-technical team members out of the direct discussion because your policy making is executed via code. And the other thing is that you get in this objectivity fetish to zone where people start thinking that because it's data, it's objective. When in reality, you've enshrined the subjective choices of the people who designed those algorithms, which is also okay. You just have to acknowledge that you've done it and then give fair processes for people to say, hey, look, like, I know we thought that was going to be fair, but look, and this happened in the praise in the comment stack, like, like if we segment the contributions by, let's say, working group or contribution type, it's skewed really heavy towards this working group or this contribution type. Well, why? Well, as it turns out, our our machinery for collecting data just happened to skew that way a little bit. So our data skewed that way a little bit. So that doesn't make our outcome objective. It means that the subjectivity lived at the level of the data collection method. And so if you see that, you might say, okay, well, we decided to do this for now, and maybe we'll keep those rewards, but let's intervene for the future and try to, and essentially make a meta KPI that says, now I have these buckets, and like, look, we know as an organization that we value, these 6 kinds of labor. And so when we look at our segmentations of our rewards across, people by which working groups they're in, or which types of labor they provide, or, these different batchings or segmentations, we can actually look at whether the rewards are meaningfully distributed over those segments. And that creates a sort of, KPI for your KPIs that allows you to assess whether your measurements and reward systems are actually doing their job. If they're not actually distributing in buckets that are at least in the neighborhood of the values that your organization has, like these are the work we value, then your measurement system's not doing a good job. And it's a bit like cross-validation in machine learning. You just have to construct your own notion because, again, a different community might value a different kind of work. And so you can't use the same segments for every group.
Thanks.
Then David had a question. You are muted, I guess.
Thanks for reminding me. My apologies.
Once again.
So so when I was hearing you speak, Michael, my question evolved, grew, then got smaller again. Now it's grown again, but I have been able to just put it all together into one thing based on your most recent contribution here. One question I have is around the extensibility. So once you have, actually, it's a bootstrapping question and an extensibility question combined into one. One problem or one difficulty that I see, probably based on my growing understanding, is that what is the minimum viable kind of set of information that you need in order to be able to bootstrap such a contribution graph? I'm asking this with the background of how early in a DAO's life cycle is it possible to get started with this? And what kind of data do you need, or what kind of measurement systems do you need? Coupled with this question, how extensible is it really? At which point in time? Are there potential breakpoints where you basically hit a roadblock and have to start from zero again? This is the kind of question I'm asking.
Cool. I'm going to try to answer this with something concrete, which is uncharacteristic for me. All right. So here's something that I was drafting the other day. So I've been contributing to this OL project. It's a Diem fork. Personally, I think I'm really thrilled that Facebook is not launching Diem and that some public network is running the MoveVM. But this is, of course, my main research is around communities and the data and stuff. So I wrote this reporting standards for community wallets, which in this case, a community wallet is a bit like a grant program. It pays for labor contributions, but that means that you need, if you want transparency, you need to be able to say something about what labor happened and it was valuable. And so this little mock-up basically says, look, there's contributors, so almost the CRM, and there are payments, but payments are attached to activities. And so the crux of this was something I call extensible schemas. And extensible schemas basically say, look, like you can provide minimum amount of data. You have a unique identifier of an actor who is an account, and then an account might have a type. And then, for example, if I made type 0, I could have some extra fields. And in this case, I define these as optional fields so people don't strictly have to dox themselves. But like if you're actually contributing in a network that provides people the opportunity, I might need to include my GitHub ID or a Discord ID or a Twitter ID, because these are the or GDocs ID, because these are the platforms I'm interacting in. So if someone were to want to validate that I contributed in a meaningful way, they probably need to validate that by the mapping between the address that I'm using to receive payments and which is again, my unique ID in the system, and the various modes or identities through which I would interact. So this extensible schemas concept is basically saying that I could say this record only really requires the notion of account and a type, a type implies some sort of details that will be here so that someone can actually make this machine readable. And then this complements with an extensible schema for something like, and again, in this case, a bounty, where, okay, cool, we've got this idea, the identifier or the enricher for the transaction ID. Again, it's a type, which just means something about what I'm expecting to see in terms of data. And then here, okay, well, these are missions from the job board, and they had a URI to the job board, and it says, okay, well, who wrote the tasks? Who did the tasks? Okay, who reviewed the tasks? All right, here's some artifacts, GitHub repos, documents, blogs, whatever. And then you would in turn, maybe put a bundle of these and make a payment. And so the reason I'm showing you this is because I think that the answer is that it depends so much on what you're doing that you need this extensible schema concept where you just start to create a minimum viable representation of what is labor. And then you use, in this case, JSON-like structure to make it machine readable. And then by virtue of using this kind of thing, you can extend over time these types, and maybe some of them go out of use. So like for whatever reason, receivable is what I called the default because it literally had only a memo field. But like over time, you could say, okay, but activities of this type are going to go under some new index. We'll give it a name, maybe a description, require some fields, have some optional fields. In a way, it's a standard for standards for data, which allows the data standard itself to evolve without breaking the underlying data structure. And so this is also something that's an evolution of some of the research we talked about in the talk, because I was talking about attribution networks and contribution graphs and DAGs. And so this particular description that I wrote up was because I was contributing to the analytics working group to get a feel for how this community was organizing itself. And my main contribution was along these lines, like what is a minimal schema that is extensible, that solves for both crap, it's bootstrapping, the very first activities are happening and we need to collect data on them, with shit, in the future, there could be unknown, complex, whatever contributions that also need to fit within the overall system if we want to preserve the transparency in the future. So I hope that's a good answer. It's literally the extensible schemas and JSON objects, maybe future MongoDB, maybe future on-chain data, who knows? But the idea is the ontology is itself not fixed because it allows you to keep adding new record types with different constellations of data, but it has at least some basic concepts as keys, which is to say there is a account, which is a unique identifier of an address, could be an Ethereum address if you were doing something like this for ETH. It's not all that different from what the identity resolution solution that the metagamers were using way back when they first started using source credit.
Okay, just to be sure, this is this extensible schema is reasonably easily implementable with source cred, or is that a lot of overhead? Just
source cred data structures are kind of along these lines anyway. I would say what I just described is more like, that's really prototypey. Like I just was like, shit, some people did some stuff and they need to get paid, and analytics working group or circle is going to try to report on that so people can see what's happening. And for that, we need data. Again, analytics working group, right? Measurement and KPIs and reporting. And so in order to create measurements, you need to create data. But in order to create data, you need to create schemas. But when you fix schemas, you fix the notion of what is valuable. So the concept of an extensible schema is basically a really thin schema that says that there are events with, say, transaction IDs, and there are actors with addresses, and then insofar as we are in this case accounting for transactions, payments, you would have all of the extra metadata about the contributions that where the payments were for in one of these extensible schemas. but it doesn't have to be transaction IDs in the sense of, transactions on a blockchain like sends. It could be anything else, like any event unique ID. But what I'm trying to say is actors and events and artifacts, which is similar to the drawing that I made earlier, actors, events, and artifacts. If you have actors, events, and artifacts, you can kind of combine, you can start to get a graph, and that graph is interrelating those things. And if you're using this extensible schemas concept, you're basically trying to include as little as possible in the first order data structure, and then including some sort of extensible typing, or think of it like headers, right? You're basically saying, look, follow these rules at the top level protocol. And then if you provide a header, it just gives you extra instructions about how to interpret the stuff next layer down. And so if you take that approach, you can start with something which is really simple and grow it over time, because the header or the typing is going to give you the tools that you need to describe how to interpret the actual more detailed data.
All right, I think Livy has a question that is connected to this one, and then Rodolfo, you are next. Livy in the chat, could that be used as a single source of identity information that can be used with multiple reward systems at once?
So I'm gonna say yes and no. One thing is, you can have a giant God's eye reputation CRM, collaborative CRM thing. I think to some extent there's a proof of personhood passport concept being developed by the Gitcoin team that sort of fits in that paradigm. I am somewhat leery of those kinds of systems. I think it's not bad to have them, but they shouldn't become prerequisites too much. So another aspect of the document that I had just shared was that I was advocating away from a centralized repository of contributor metadata towards effectively a context dependent sort of individual, hey, I chose to share this information with this particular context and maybe different information with another. Like maybe I don't want to use the same account and the same social sign-ins for the different activities. I should have the right to fracture my identity. Now, I may still need to build a reputation in a context in order to contribute. So as an analytics working group member, I need to do useful stuff and talk to people and gain credibility by contributing, and not just expect to show up and be treated like I'm an expert until I've sort of demonstrated that expertise. Or if I go jump into a working group that's not really my area of expertise, maybe I have to learn and develop and do stuff and get a good first issue and whatever, and build up my reputation. So, if I want to have privacy and transparency at the same time, I do actually want to give the contributors more power to, choose how to segment their identity. That doesn't mean that you can get away with easy Sybil attacks, because if you choose to segment your identity, you might have to redo the work to develop meaningful reputation within a context. So there are utilities for people choosing to aggregate their reputation, but there are also benefits for people choosing to fracture it. So I tend to think that a good solution is one that continues to afford that choice to the individuals. And kind of back to my point about the Gitcoin thing, I think it's fine that proof of personhood passports exist, and there are a lot of use cases where they'll be really valuable. Gitcoin itself is uses quadratic funding, so it's relatively susceptible to Sybils. So anything that reduces the likelihood or makes Sybil harder is good for their system, and they may enforce higher degrees of individual uniqueness, like higher measurements. But then there's got to be other contexts where people don't need that, because you don't want to have an economy, a labor economy, where you have to dox yourself to participate. You just might have to choose what part of the economy to participate in. You might go work in an environment that's more conducive to letting you build a context dependent identity without, say, joining it with your meat space identity. But as long as you're willing to pay your dues and take the time, you should be able to do that. At least maybe that's again a values policy making thing. But I see, we already have pretty heavy surveillance capitalist systems that we're trying to move away from. If we want to make meaningful differences, they're not just in the hey, we're using Web3 technologies. They're about changing the policies enshrined in those things. So we don't want to go from surveillance capitalism to, I don't know, surveillance communism overnight. We still want to give people choice and the ability to vote with their feet and move between systems and have privacy, etc. Yeah, selective disclosure is a good term. I like that. Thanks, Walter.
Rodolfo, you have a question.
Hey, yes. Hey, Z. Thanks again. Always great. It's always great talk. I had a question about coordinate and systems like that don't require preset reward metrics, KPI systems, and let just like the contributors in smaller groups, right, distribute rewards according to perception, which it has its own potential flaws. But in the context of of your work, have you thought about that? Where does it fit?
So we talked a little bit earlier in this call about how more subjective methods work when groups are small. Part of the way that you can make this work is this concept called subsidiarity. Subsidiarity is the idea that you push the decision-making authority as close to those who are impacted by it, or you might have somewhat hierarchical structures, but you are still trying to make the decision-making happen low, not high. You want as little at the top as possible, and the decision-making to happen at low levels. So if you fractal something down to the point where the group that's working is small enough, then I actually think that's great. I think it means that you are in the regime where that direct observation is valid. But going back to the point I made earlier about being able to see and value that work, the graph of peer-to-peer reputation, if you are having to evaluate work of people that you haven't worked with, it doesn't work very well. Like even with praise, it's sort of like that kind of thing where there are people calling out each other for their contributions, and it works great as long as the people who are actively participating in the praise calling out process are able to see everything and are collectively representative of all of the groups and can net balance things. But that's actually really hard because it's unlikely that it will naturally occur as a representative. The people who participate in certain types of social activities are going to be the ones who are most commonly and most actively involved, and they may have less clear perception of people who do, I don't want to call them antisocial activities, but maybe introvert activities, some of which include token engineers, people who might just spend a bunch of time on a whiteboard thinking through something, or trying to do a derivation, or fighting with the Jupyter notebook themselves, and then occasionally give an output, but maybe that's less frequent, but the amount of work per interaction is different. So it's pretty natural for any social sort of subjective community-based thing to need to happen at a very local level, small teams. And so my instinct for this is to continue to build on the sort of sociocracy concepts and make sure that we have a function segmentation concept where a large DAO that wants to make use of that kind of mechanism actually first breaks itself out over areas of work, possibly working groups for operations, working groups for communication and community management, working groups for technical development, maybe multiple working groups on different projects within technical development, et cetera, which will give you a sort of first order sort of teams or working groups or swarms, for example, in one hive, and then you'll have some sort of transversal circle where people come together to take discussions and decisions about the larger group. And then even those individual circles may have subworks, substreams, smaller working groups that have more specific sets of projects. If you are able to provide sufficient again, I guess the right term is structure. You sort of identify here's our purpose, here are the functions we need to fulfill the purpose, here are the circles or working groups fulfilling the functions. Within those functions, you now have a sort of purpose. So this concept recurses, we have functions required to fulfill our function or sub-functions. We have people taking on responsibilities. If you actually start to break down and map your organization, you can actually get to the point where I think almost all of those local regions are sufficiently small, you know, in the sort of Scrum sense, 2 pizza teams or smaller, where people really do have good mutual visibility and they can do a more sort of subjective, direct mutual valuation. But then you get this sort of, okay, you go up a level and you say, okay, well, how do we make those same decisions? Maybe not over individuals, but over groups. And you go up a level, how do we make those decisions? Maybe not over individuals, but over the constituent groups. And so this kind of fractaling is also pretty natural, but it can be tricky because it does start to impose some hierarchy if you model it that way. You can also model it less as a hierarchy and more as just a graph, where you don't treat any particular group as, you know, a subsidiary of another group, but rather just a graph of groups. But, you know, that will get you a less coordinated net entity. So I think depending on what the organization is, it might be appropriate to have something, you know, deeper or fatter or, you know, more webbed and less hierarchical. And so you can tell I like graph models, but in my head, I see these sort of power structure graphs, which represent the relations between not just individuals and groups, but groups and groups, to try to create a, you know, hopefully a, you know, not a one directional power flow, but actually a meaningful balance of powers that's appropriately matched to the functions and purposes of these organizations.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Lots to think about.
All right. We can take a final question before we are on top of the hour. Any final question, comment? Many questions about the slide deck. So we'll share the recording. I don't know, Michael, if you can share the slide deck as well.
Yeah, I think I can.
Okay.
I made it this morning.
Okay. Any confidential data? No.
I don't think so.
And yeah, the links would be cool also to further explore.
And if you have some research articles on the modeling approach for further studies, that would be pretty cool.
I need to do more writing. Honestly, if there are people interested in writing more research sort of academic articles, I'm generally open to collaboration because my current footprint is mostly, so we do a lot of R&D at BlockScience internally. We publish sometimes, but way less than we should. And then, you know, collaborate with MetaGov for some of the more governance related stuff. So it crosses over with the more formal mathematics and simulation at BlockScience. And then from a, you know, honestly, to the token engineering community and the MetaGov community are my main modes of outreach. So the academic side is an open question, largely driven by available collaborators.
So this is the call for applications, right?
Kind of. Yeah, I mean,
Source credit would be used.
Yeah.
Is the assumption.
No, but the funny thing is I don't want to oversell it because I mean, it also, like anything, it's a policy making thing. So like it should be used when it's a good fit. And I do think it's a good fit for some things, but it makes sense as the activities scale because it's providing a shift from, it's a nice mixture of algorithmic and normative, but it's still, I see it as a scaling tool. And so if your collaboration is small enough, then its overhead is higher than the improvement it gives on your measurement. Right, because there's overhead there. And that's actually really important to remember, that your governance infrastructure is going to evolve with your organization. You shouldn't try to put in place the infrastructure for a 2,000 person group when you're 5 people. And you don't want to try to run a 2,000 person group with what would work well for 5 people.
Okay, with that, thank you so much Michael, for this session, for all the inputs. Again, we will share the material in the alumni group and the research group. And I think we'll close the call for 10 minutes to enable everyone to grab a drink, because the research group on the DAO reward systems will continue for a sharing session and discussion on what we have been doing this day, today, in the workshops with Michael and with Matthew Slater earlier. And you are all, everyone, warmly invited to join us tomorrow for our DAO Reward Systems Assemblage. We have, I think, in total 20 talks on the topic of reward systems, looking from many angles, looking from fairness, equality, challenge of community building, stability, then introducing tools. We take a look at SourceCred, coordinate, praise if you're interested, and we'll have a DAO failure party sharing the most successful reward systems failures. Everybody's invited to add some personal experience. This is all tomorrow. Yeah, thanks, Patti. She shared the agenda and also the link in case you haven't registered yet. So hopefully we see each other tomorrow. And with that, thank you for today. Thanks everyone for joining, and the reward systems team will meet again in 10 minutes. All right, then we'll open the call again. Thanks everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Probably just gonna stay on, but I'm gonna go grab some water too. Actually, I also realized people are gonna start showing up if they didn't make it to the workshop.
Yeah, you can grow. I can stay here
Okay.
for a bit.
All right, I'll be back.
I don't know. Yeah.
Hi, Patty. How was the workshop?
Hello, it was great. Lots of information, many questions. Missed you. We
Yeah, I
missed you.
think Zargham. Yeah, Zargham can get very technical, I know.
Yeah, it was pretty technical.
I would love to see the recording later because I had another meeting back then. So yeah, I mean, Zargham was what introduced me to all these worlds of the common stack. So
you just missed him.
yeah.
He was here. Well, the recording will be shared later. Don't worry. I'll even stop the recording so we have just